Really good first start. Okay, we're going to get started right now. If you're here in this room, this is the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Draft Guidelines Workshop. This is for 2015-2016 fiscal year. We're really excited to be here, and we're going to get started. So I'm going to let the last few people come into the room and start from there. Just a couple of housekeeping things. This presentation will be webcast, so those of you who in the audience have questions, we have a roving mic, and please be sure to speak into the mic. Those of you who are participating from other parts of the state, thank you for being patient with us as we try to describe things the best we can if you can't see where things are happening and what's happening. And if you have, those of you remotely, if you have questions, please email them to our generic AHSC inbox, which is ahsc@sgc.ca.gov, and we will respond to them as quickly as we can. For those of you who are here, this is the first of 4 workshops on the AHSC guidelines. My name is Allison Joe. I'm the Deputy Director for the Strategic Growth Council. I'm joined here by Jennifer Seeger, who is Housing Policy Manager at the Department of Housing and Community Development, and other staff from the SGC. We hope to walk you through the guidelines document that we drafted and released a little over a month ago, and provide any clarifying comments, and then also be able to take public comment with regard to your specific comments on the guidelines document. We are also accepting some comment letters by email, and it's the same AHSC email, and hopefully you will send comments through that venue as well. A couple of things, because I want to do a quick survey of the group here. If you could do a show of hands of how many are familiar with the AHSC program because you were active in it last year, whether you were an applicant or not an applicant. Okay, how many are not as familiar? So few, which is totally fine because there's a lot to know about this, and even if you were involved somewhat last year, there's a lot to cover. This is a very different kind of program, and so what we are going to do, this is a learning exercise for everyone, is to basically walk you through some of the terminology and make sure we define our acronyms correctly, and some of the terms. From those of you in a solely housing or solely transportation world, these are new concepts. The idea of looking at an integrated housing and transportation project. So we want to make sure that those are clear to you as an applicant, and then provide some opportunity for some clarifying questions as well. And so the other question that I have is, who is an interested and possible applicant for year 2? Raise your hand. Okay. So probably about 7 or 8. Some may be supporting those applications, some may be direct applicants themselves. So this is an interesting hybrid because we have these guidelines workshops really to talk about the guidelines document, the bulk of the document, but there's also some questions that may come up if you're an applicant and just want a little bit more clarity on how to proceed for this next year. We recognize that this is incredibly tight timelines and new ground that we're trying to move forward on, and so with that, we're really hoping to answer and address as many of the concerns as possible. Hopefully there's a time and a place for everyone to ask their questions. And then to that end, we actually have comment sheets that we hope that you will fill out. One, if you're interested in applying, we have actually a question about if there's interest in additional technical assistance for your application. Doesn't matter where you are, who you are, but we would like to know the universe of who and where, and so we would follow up with you at a later date. Also, if there's actually public comment that you would like to provide, we'll please note it on the form and then hand it to Kim, who's over by the computer there, or Madeline, who's up front at the front of the room, but she'll come back in. So you saw her when you came into the room. With that, did I miss anything? I don't think so. Okay, so we're going to get started and just really talk about quickly the background of the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. This program was created last year in the budget to fund projects that result in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled, passenger vehicle miles, through land use, housing, transportation, and ag land preservation practices that support infill development and compact development. What it should do, these projects, to be successful, is increase accessibility, the access to housing, employment centers, and key destinations, so where you live, work, and play, through low-carbon transportation options such as walking, biking, and transit. As I mentioned, last year was our first year. We had approximately $122 million awarded last year. We're pretty excited to get 28 great projects that all met our first year criteria. This year we have approximately $400 million available, which is a lot more. And so we've tried to adjust accordingly, given the demand that we saw in the first year, as well as the potential need for projects. This is a competitive statewide program, so all applicants compete against each other statewide, with some exceptions that we'll talk about in terms of size and scale of projects, and we'll get into those later. But 50% of all funds we have every year is required to be invested in affordable housing, hence our name. This includes affordable housing bricks and mortar, as well as infrastructure to support housing. And in addition, 50% of our funds are required to be invested in disadvantaged communities as identified by the state, and we can get into more detail on that later if needed. As I mentioned, year one, we had 28 projects funded, a little over 2,000 affordable housing units near transit, which is absolutely key to the success of this program, $32 million for active transportation, walking, biking, and transit improvements, as well as $92 million to benefit disadvantaged communities. We did, soon after we awarded in June of this year, we had a couple of lessons learned workshops, which drew a lot of response from applicants, potential applicants, as well as other stakeholders across the state. And we looked at a few factors that really challenged applicants and things that we thought of incorporating and improving in the current draft guidelines that you have in front of you. And then just for reference, we have a couple of binders that are intended for reference only. Please don't take them home unless you really want a new binder. But we have a couple of reference of the guidelines themselves. They're also available online for those of you who want to take that and look at that later. Key factors in year one really look at the project readiness, the level of readiness, and what does that really mean? Is it financial? Is it environmental? Is it staffing-wise? What does that mean? Thinking about leverage, again, financial leverage related to other funding sources. Challenges relating to housing unit density. Some projects are not as able to get to the densities required by the state. Proximity to dense job centers and how that fits into the calculations and the criteria for scoring. Being able to balance transit and active transportation investments with housing. Jurisdictional caps, which was at the time a limit of $15 million per local jurisdiction total for award, as well as the timing of the application. We recognized that we had some superstar applicants who were able to have a project that was ready, that met all of our criteria, submit an application, and that application process was approximately 4 months. For a new project or for a new program with limited background, this is pretty stupendous. So we appreciate the patience that everyone had there. But those were key factors. And in this version of the draft guidelines, we'll get into detail about this in subsequent slides, but what we have tried to do is better balance that transportation investments in and reflection of transportation investments that support direct mode shift. So as opposed to looking at amenities related to bicycle parking, bicycle repair kiosks, things like that, those are helpful. Those are more amenities in serving the bike and bicycle user. We really wanted to incorporate more bicycle lanes, which actually directly change that mode shift. Other things like sidewalks directly changes that mode shift as opposed to things that are helpful but not as directly impactful. We refined the transit-oriented development and integrated connectivity project types. So this is back to the scale of project, looking at a balance of housing, transportation, and transit investments. And then we also provided incentives for housing and transportation collaboration and partnerships. In addition, we looked a lot at how we could improve our greenhouse gas emissions scoring criteria. This is a work in progress, and the other thing that I would also note is that, that the draft quantification methodology from the Air Resources Board is available online. There are a few copies that you can take and keep in the back. We may not have enough, but they're all posted online. So we refined the quantification methodology for our program, as well as added a few supplemental strategies which we believe accentuate and support additional GHG reductions. And we'll get into more detail on that too. We created a new project type category. So you have transit-oriented development, a TOD, an integrated connectivity project, an ICP, and then this third new category which supports rural innovation. These are the rural innovation project areas are intended to keep to allow for those rural projects to compete amongst themselves. So you wouldn't necessarily have a rural project competing with a more suburban or urban project, but you would have that rural area that could actually be just as innovative, but less competitive because of its size and the scale. We eliminated the jurisdictional cap for localities and incentivized use of 4% low-income housing tax credits. Pretty key for those of you who are in the housing community. We also increased our award amounts to up to $20 million regardless of what kind of project type you are. So if you are an ICP, last year you were limited to $8 million total. Now we've removed that and you're eligible for up to $20 million. And at a TOD last year it was $15 million. This year it's up to 20. We clarified other things related to financial readiness, and then really thought about some of the scoring criteria and how they should be applied given the kinds of projects we were trying to encourage. These are related to community benefit, engagement, community engagement, as well as access to destinations, housing affordability, and anti-displacement. I'm going to pass it on to Jennifer, and she'll go into more detail. For right now, I'm just going to pause. Everything's okay. Everyone can hear me. There aren't any major issues, burning questions. Okay. We're going to pass it on. So Jennifer Seeger with Housing and Community Development.
A little shuffling, sorry. Yeah. All right, good afternoon. So I wanted to go over a little more detail on some of the key proposed revisions that Allison highlighted. As she mentioned, the proposed revisions are really based off of lessons learned from the implementation of round one and also those lessons learned workshops that we did during the summer. Let's just kind of jump right into it. So what does AHSC fund? There are 5 eligible use categories, 4 of which are capital projects, and then we have program activities as well. The first 2 there, you'll see the affordable housing development and the housing related infrastructure. Those haven't significantly changed since round one. Affordable housing can include new construction, acquisition and rehabilitation, preservation, and conversion from non-residential to residential uses. For the housing related infrastructure, the thing to remember here, and the key is that it's an infrastructure improvement that is a condition of the approval of an affordable housing development. So that's the universe that we're looking at when we're talking about housing related infrastructure. No significant changes there from round one. Where you do see significant changes is in the next 2 bullets. The sustainable transportation and transit related infrastructure, or what we're calling STI, and the transportation or transit related amenities, or TRA. In round one, this was one category. We referred to it as transportation related infrastructure, TRI. Lots of acronyms to remember here. But for round 2, we split it out, and the primary goal for splitting it into 2 different categories is to really fund more meaningful transportation investments where they're needed most. And I think you'll see this come into play as we go through the required components of different project area types. But just a little information on what these 2 different categories now fund. So the sustainable transportation or transit-related infrastructure, or STI, focuses on active transportation and transit improvements, which directly result in mode shift from passenger vehicles, and we're really looking for enhancements or improvements to a public transit access, a pedestrian network, or a bicycle network. And then transportation-related amenities, or TRA, that's really those supporting amenities for transit riders, pedestrians, and cyclists. So bus shelters, benches, shade trees, those types of things that make those interactions with the transit, bicycle, or pedestrian networks more enjoyable. And then for the program activities, this hasn't changed from round one either. So we fund programs related to active transportation or transit ridership incentives. That could include transit passes for affordable housing developments, and then also community outreach and education, safe route to school type programs as well. Okay, so Allison mentioned that we have 3 project area types. The Transit-Oriented Development, or TOD project area, the Integrated Connectivity Project Area, or ICP, and then new for round 2 is the Rural Innovation Project Area, or what we refer to as a RIPA. So for transit-oriented development projects, the key distinguishing feature of a TOD is really the presence of high-quality transit. So the project area must be served by high-quality transit, which includes bus or rail service, and we're really looking for here 15-minute peak period headways, as well as service 7 days a week. We're also looking for some sort of dedicated infrastructure to demonstrate the permanence of the route. So that could be a dedicated bus lane, HOV lane, something to show that the route isn't going to shift or change. For round 1, we required both affordable housing or housing-related infrastructure, so some sort of housing-related investment, as well as a transportation-related investment. So you had to combine both. For round 2, recognizing that TOD areas already have a significant investment in transportation just by the nature of the requirements for the project area and the presence of high-quality transit, but don't necessarily have the affordable housing located in proximity to those transportation options. For round 2, what we're proposing in the guidelines is to require affordable housing or housing-related infrastructure, and then that can be combined with any other use. It could be a capital use or a program use. The affordable housing development does need to be located within a half mile of that high-quality transit station or stop, so there is a proximity requirement. And this really provides a lot more flexibility for project applicants in addressing the needs of the project area. But we'll discuss later some revisions to the scoring criteria as well that really get to, because we still want to encourage and we still want to incentivize partnerships between housing and transportation. So we've kind of removed that requirement from the project area types, but included some scoring criteria and some points that heavily encourage that. So here's a couple TOD project examples. Again, you have to have either affordable housing development or housing-related infrastructure, and then that can be combined with any additional use. So here you see stationary improvements, the bus shelters, benches, that would be your TRA type investment, sidewalks dedicated to bicycle paths, that would be like a sustainable transportation infrastructure capital use, transit signal priority systems also. You could also do a program here, so you could do affordable housing with one or more programmatic activities. All right, so an integrated connectivity project. So ICP project areas must be served by qualifying transit, and that differs from high quality transit in that we're not requiring the 15-minute headways. So we are looking for at least one station or stop within the project area that's served by bus, rail, or flexible transit, but it doesn't have to have a 15-minute headway. New for 2015, we're requiring sustainable transportation infrastructure as a required use within an integrated connectivity project area to increase the accessibility and availability of transit options and active transportation options within the area. And then you could include, or you have to include at least one additional use, and that one additional use could be affordable housing, AHD or HRI, could be transportation-related amenities, or it could be a program use. So the Rural Innovation Project Area, or the RIPA. So this is the new project area for round 2. The inclusion of the RIPA really recognizes the unique characteristics and needs of rural communities by supporting innovative projects which achieve the GHG and VMT reduction goals of the program. So RIPAs cannot be served by high quality transit, but they must also, as we said for ICPs, you must have at least one identified transit station or stop served by qualifying transit. Must be located within a rural area. For a rural area, we're looking at the Health and Safety Code definition that's also used by TCAC for their rural project requirements. And then you must meet the same requirements as an ICP. So again, we're looking for an investment in sustainable transportation infrastructure combined with any additional use. So here are some examples for the ICP or RIPA project area applications. Again, it's an investment in sustainable transportation infrastructure plus at least one additional capital or program use. Here we have a bicycle or pedestrian connections from employment center to transit plus investments to a transit station. You could do something related to transit station area improvements and then combine that with affordable housing. Or you could do a van pool or some sort of flexible transit fleet purchase and then combine that with a transit ridership program. So there are a multitude of different ways that you can pull this together, meeting the 2 requirements of sustainable transportation infrastructure and at least one additional use. All right, so for the award range, as Allison mentioned, we increased the total amount available per application to $20 million for round 2, and that's regardless of the different type of project area application. So TOD, ICPs, and RIPAs are all eligible to receive up to $20 million per application. The awards for affordable housing development are determined by MHP calculations, and we're looking at between $55,000 and $105,000 per unit, depending on the size and the affordability of that unit. And we've also increased new for round 2 from $30,000 to $50,000 per unit boost for the utilization of 4% tax credits. Housing-related infrastructure awards are determined by the number of units in the related affordable housing development, and those are sized up to $50,000 per restricted unit and $35,000 per unrestricted unit. For the STI and TRA awards, those are grants, and they're determined based on the cost of the infrastructure improvements that you're proposing. And then program awards, if you're applying to us for program funds, those are based on costs typically associated with the program creation or expansion. We could do either. And we will also fund up to 3 years of operational costs for that program. Just to highlight on a couple other changes in the guidelines, planning costs were a separate eligible use category in round 1. You'll notice that that's no longer its own category, but it has been integrated into each of the other capital project eligible use categories and would still be an allowable cost. All AHSC funded affordable housing developments must provide at least 1 secure overnight bicycle parking space for every 2 units. This is new for this year. AHSC program funds can be used to cover the costs of providing those bicycle parking spaces. However, you can't use that activity to address one of the 2 component requirements in your project area type. So it can't be your second use. We can fund it, but you can't count it as a second use. We also included some clarification that acquisition and substantial rehabilitation projects are exempt from the minimum density requirements. And then included some information on the amount of AHSC funds allowed for parking. So for round 2, we're tying that to a percentage reduction of the parking requirements for the affordable housing development as compared to what's required of base zoning, within the jurisdiction, and we're looking at funding between 10 and 30,000 per space, depending on that percentage reduction. And there's also a note in the guidelines that it's the intention of the council to eliminate funds entirely for parking in future funding rounds. So you'll probably see a progressive decrease in the amount of funds that are available for parking over the years, with the intention to eliminate that from the program entirely at some point in the future. So the proposed application process looks pretty similar to year one. We've got a two-phased process, the first being a concept proposal stage. Then we would review concept proposals and invite applicants back to submit a full application. Full applications would then be reviewed by staff and funding recommendations made to the Strategic Growth Council for their review and approval. So the threshold requirements for the program, there's two different types of thresholds that we're looking at. The first are the statutory thresholds, and then there's also some programmatic thresholds that are included in the guidelines. For the statutory thresholds, same three as we had in year one. You have to demonstrate that the proposed project will result in a GHG reduction, that the proposed project supports the implementation of a sustainable community strategy or similar regional plan, and then also that the proposed project is consistent with the state planning priorities. So those are our three statutory thresholds. Programmatic thresholds, we review for these at concept, but you must be able to demonstrate that each of these programmatic thresholds will be in place by the time of full application. And what we're looking for here is demonstration of project readiness, and that includes all environmental clearances that have been secured, includes both CEQA and NEPA. All entitlements have been secured, excluding design review on the project. That the applicant has site control, and that there are no outstanding legal challenges to the project. You also need to be able to demonstrate that construction is not started on the project, and that the project addresses climate adaptation, and that there's no conversion of working or natural resource lands as part of the completion of the project. The concept proposal required components. So at the concept stage, what we're focusing on and what the application will include is a brief narrative on the project overview. We're looking for a project description, location and map of the project, identification of the project area type, whether you're applying as a TOD, an ICP, or a RIPA. Eligibility for set-asides, this would be for the affordable housing and the disadvantaged community set-asides. Also looking for a description of the co-benefits that will be achieved through the project, and a description of the funds requested and the types of eligible uses or eligible costs that will be requested. You also need to be able, again, to demonstrate you've addressed all of the statutory requirements and that you will be able to address all of the programmatic requirements by the time that the full application would be due. The concepts will be invited to full application based on a couple of different criteria. The first is that the project needs to be eligible, needs to meet the eligibility requirements for the project area type for which it is applying, that you've again addressed the statutory and programmatic thresholds. And then to the extent that we have applications submitted or concept applications submitted in excess of the total funds that we have available, so 200% or more of the funds we have available, we're proposing to rank and filter invites to full application based on this calculation of readiness. So we're looking at the AHSC dollar requested plus any enforceable funding commitments in hand minus deferred costs divided by the total development costs. So there was some thinking that went into this as we were going through and trying to figure out what an appropriate filter would be at concept. And the AHSC dollar requested as part of the calculation because we wanted to be sure that we weren't harming projects that were coming in and requesting a substantial amount of money from us to complete a project. So particularly for those transportation capital projects, you may be coming in for a larger dollar request based on the total development cost of the project, but through the application of this calculation, there should not be any bias or unfairness in terms of how that's applied. So the invitations will consider our ability to meet both the affordable housing, the disadvantaged community set-asides, and then also our ability to meet the TOD, ICP, and RIPA set-asides. So Allison mentioned that 10% of the total available funds will be targeted towards RIPA or rural projects, and we also have targets for TOD and ICP, 40% of the funds targeted towards TOD projects and 30% for ICPs. So we will ensure through the invitations at concept stage that we're able to meet each and every one of those set-asides or targets. I think I'm going to pass it on to Allison for the scoring.
So what we have here, we're going to get into the scoring criteria, a little bit about how we scored last year, but I'm trying to not get too bogged down in these specific details. What we wanted to do is, again, acknowledge that the greenhouse gas emissions quantification is an important and really the primary driver of these funds and the projects that we are trying to fund, but also recognize the policy objectives that we are trying to achieve on top of that. What we looked at in last year, the GHG quantification methodology was essentially one component which resulted in about 55% of the total score. This year we've broken it down where GHG quantification is still important. It is 50% of the score. However, the quantification methodology is more of a hybrid and more of it reflects the diversity of GHG quantifications available and how our program chooses to actually consider those GHG quantifications. So with that 30% of what, and actually even it's 15% of what we calculated at 55% last year is really looking at your GHGs per dollar. And I'll get into that in a sec. And then we also looked at supplemental GHG reducing strategies through that. This is essentially the total scoring criteria for an application that comes through, and what I would encourage those of you who have projects is to go through the criteria, see how your projects fare, and see if it's a good match, essentially. If there are challenges with the project that you are thinking about and the criteria that we have that would be applied to it, we would appreciate any comments towards that. If it's something that is in line with the program, our objectives, it's something that we want to try to achieve, then, it's something that we should acknowledge and understand. There are a universe of projects out there and combinations of projects, and we won't know until we see some of these projects come forward to see how well we can apply the criteria we've drafted at this point. And again, as we go through the specific criteria, if there's anything that needs to be more specifically drawn out, more specifically clarified, things that are too broad, things like that, it'll be really helpful for us to hear that and understand how that affects your projects in the real world. So out of this, each project would have an eligible score of up to 100 points. Some projects may not actually have an eligible total of 100 points. So if you looked at a transportation-only project, you would not necessarily have score on housing affordability. So that would change your total score. And what we do is when we receive all projects, we base everything on a percentage. So you would be scored on a percentage scale in comparison with other projects. I'm going to first start and talk about the GHG emissions reductions quantification score. As I mentioned before, the middle section here, the efficiency of reductions, was essentially what was scored at 55 points last year. We are looking at doing a maximum of 15 points for this category in the second year, plus looking at the total project greenhouse gas emissions reduced. They have a similar concept in terms of the binning. This is kind of a different, this is essentially a scale. You're competitive with all the other projects within your project area category. So all TODs would be looked at in total and then ranked the top 20% would get 15 points for bin 1. For the second 20% would get 12 points, and so on for both the project GHG reduction score and the efficiency of reductions. They may not be the same groupings, but that's definitely a way to compare scale of project. So for that, there's a total of 30 maximum points awarded. I'm happy to go through this in a little bit more detail, but I think that's the gist of this. The binning is a complicated scoring criteria. It is a bit of a question mark as you submit your application because you have to know what the other projects have. And in some ways, that's part of the competition of these projects, a little bit of uncertainty. I want to talk a little bit about the draft GHG quantification methodology. We had received a number of comments from our lessons learned workshops in the summer, and what we have brought forward is a draft GHG methodology from ARB. It has some additional clarifications as well as some tables that help determine emissions factors. The methodology that is in draft form uses existing tools to allow for a consistent statewide approach. Again, based on vehicle miles traveled only, we have the supplemental strategies which look at active transportation and water and energy and greening types of reductions. We've added some methods to calculate new train and or ferry service, but it is not all inclusive. So this is the other thing that we want to mention is we know that particularly related to reduction of VMT, we have not guessed and tried to assume all of the different ways that VMT can be reduced. We've not provided quantification for all of the possible ways. However, if there's something that you believe your project reduces VMT in that is not covered, please provide us comments so we can work on those and incorporate them into a new quantification methodology. I think that's part of it is we are not mind readers, but we are also trying to be as upfront as possible in trying to get the kinds of methodologies we're looking for here and that you're looking for. And then we also have some of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund reporting methods. Some of you have been tracking this through ARB, information on how to report after a project is selected for funding. We would note that we're not requiring you to meet exactly the GHG reductions that you have claimed on in your application. These are projections. However, we use it as a very close proxy. So if you don't necessarily achieve exactly to the decimal point that reduction, that is something that we would want you to report, but it's not something that is thought of negatively. We won't take your funding away for that reason alone. And then what we're doing, because this is a draft and there are a lot of things moving at the same time, we are looking at updates to the Cal-EMOD model, and that is something that is not done by the state. This is done through the California Association of Pollution Officers, and I think I almost got that acronym right, but CAPCOA, and they are technically in charge of the improvements to the model. Annually, they provide an update to the model, and we've been working closely with them, SGC, ARB, and others to essentially help improve the model to help us use this tool for our program. The update to that model is intended to be done in time for round 2 applications, but it's uncertain, and to that end, the calculations in the quantification methodology are provided as off model calculations, so they're included as if we were going to include them in, and we expect that those would be made. They may be made in the model directly. They may be made outside of that, basically calculated by hand, if you will. The other thing that we will hope to include are some automated calculations, things that make it a little easier for user error, to prevent user error from occurring. So those are things that we hope to expand on in the final draft. And again, we've been working with ARB staff to make sure that what we do in the guidelines is appropriately reflected in the quantification methodology. Then on to the scoring criteria. As I mentioned, there are some supplemental strategies for GHG reduction. One, acknowledging the importance of active transportation and their GHG reduction potential, and noting the limitations of that that in the Cal-E-Mod and the Cal-E-Mod model. We are looking at incorporating points for the installation, expansion, or improvement of active transportation infrastructure, which looks at the whys of including that infrastructure with that specific component. Again, back to the original concept of this program and the application, you should have a housing development with connecting infrastructure that is meaningful and that actually makes a difference with relation to those residents or that transit, right? As much as it does good to be able to build sidewalks, they've got to connect to people and how we get around. We're looking at water, energy, and greening. This is something that, again, if those of you who have great interest in green infrastructure, water, low-impact development, as well as energy efficiency and renewable on-site renewables, this is something we ask that you pay particular interest in and help us better structure this component. 10 points would be, up to 10 points would be for the incorporation of infrastructure components or building standards that contribute to reductions in GHG emissions through, these are non-VMT related, right? Carbon sequestration, energy efficiency, renewable energy solutions, low impact development and green infrastructure. And essentially what we're asking for are elements above and beyond the Title 24 Green Building Code. We think that they are mostly applicable to both housing and transportation improvements, and we'd ask that anyone who thinks that they could be improved to better incorporate transportation improvements, provide that input as well. These do include urban greening components and as well as on-site building energy efficiency programs, looking at low impact development, looking at the model water ordinance that is being developed by the Department of Water Resources. We've kind of looked at this as more of a catch-all, recognizing their overall importance and the challenge of requiring each of these things to happen, trying to avoid the Christmas tree effect, if you will. But these are supplemental strategies for GHG reduction. The other thing that is new, and as Jennifer mentioned, relatively important given the program itself, is the emphasis on housing and transportation collaboration. As you saw, we stepped back from our original project area definitions for a transit-oriented development and an ICP, an integrated connectivity project. We also are concerned about joint and several liability issues. However, we recognize that these partnerships are possible, but they do take time. So this collaboration really, and these points, encourage applications brought forth as joint applicants between a housing component and a transportation or public agency transit component. There are points there's various points based on how you would reflect that. So coming forward with a joint application would be the greatest, you would achieve the greatest number of points, plus with significant transportation and housing investments. So it's not just a nominal transportation investment, it is actually significant. And we measure significance by dollar amounts, which is something that might be worth considering as well. We also look at how those projects are integrated, again, back to the nature of the program itself and the projects. Other policy objectives that we look at include the depth and level of housing affordability. This has increased from last year to 10 points. Looking at community benefit and engagement. This is somewhat different than last year. That last year we talked about co-benefits, and co-benefits are really important. However, we also felt that we got that our project or our program in and of itself is kind of encourages co-benefits by nature of co-benefits to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So thinking about GHG reductions as your primary benefit, anything that is a co-benefit, like providing affordable housing, is almost a gimme when you think about this program. What we wanted to do was encourage and ensure that the kind of projects we were funding essentially encouraged and demonstrated a benefit to the community. So what we're looking at in terms of community engagement is much more than your standard sign-in sheets and your flyers, but really an active intent from the developer or the public agency that what you are proposing to fund directly benefits the community and it reflects a community need. And so that could be done through workshop notes, through changes in draft plans, in really looking at the community benefits, in getting letters of support from direct community members, more meaningful community benefit. It's a bit different than I think most public funding programs, but I think this is something that is more along the lines of the intent of the program and the legislation. We look at access to destinations. This is a little different than the access to employment that we scored in our first year. This is a direct application of walk score and bike score to estimate accessibility and proximity of services and key destinations, a more standard way of using that, as well as funds leveraged, looking at both capital and program funds leveraged there. We're almost through this, so bear with me, but we're still under time, just for the record. This is a complicated program, so but we want to make sure you all have enough of a background and framework to kind of be able to ask questions of us after this. Anti-displacement, we are looking at the fact that projects should avoid and must avoid physical and economic displacement of low-income residents and businesses. This is for both housing and transportation projects. We want to make sure that any program funding that you are requesting for transit ridership, for active transportation, outreach, et cetera, that demonstrates a need and benefit beyond the 3-year grant period. We love funding you, but we would like to make sure there's an ongoing impact beyond the term of award and that there's the intent there to fund beyond. And then finally, the implementation of planning efforts. This really looks at strong ties to the regional sustainable community strategies, as well as any climate adaptation plans that come forward. We want to make sure that these actually do implement the plans. They're hopefully not sitting on shelves. I'm going to go through the timeline. I know this is jumping around a little bit, but this might be best to just go through and wrap this component up. So we're doing our stakeholder meetings starting this week through next week. We're looking for written comments on the draft guidelines by the end of this month, so Friday, October 30th. Our staff will be busy revising the guidelines based on your input and based on what we've heard. Actually, we had a council meeting last Thursday, so we had some really good feedback from the council as well. And providing a draft guidelines a draft final guideline, let's call it a final draft guideline, to the council by the beginning of December of this year. In theory, the council will adopt those guidelines and will be able to issue the next year's, or the notice of funding availability for funding for the next round. And we hope that'll be as early as possible, January 2016, to be safe. We are looking at concept applications being due February 2016. And as you saw earlier, the concepts are really intended to be short and a way for us to gauge whether or not you're ready, as well as just not involve too much in terms of the application process. If you are, if you are just trying to make sure that you, if you're a small applicant and you want to put in a lot of work on an application, we want to make sure it's on the full application, not on the concept level. We would then invite applicants to move forward based on the filter that Jennifer acknowledged earlier, and have those due by April, and awards would not be announced till July or August 2016. For those of you who are housing developers looking at 9% tax credits, this is after that application date, and that's the intent. And so we are looking at trying to make sure that that's understood. We know that there are future rounds. We know timing is of the essence. However, given the sheer magnitude of this program, the staff capabilities, and the comprehensiveness of this program, we don't believe that it's possible to expedite application, review, award, determination process any sooner. And in theory, I think we'll shift a little bit more so that it is more ready for spring rounds than for a summer tax credit round. I also wanted to note, for those of you who think, oh, I don't think I'm ready for this yet, I don't really know what to do with this, is that there's actually some things that we were trying to work with staff on, with staff as well as other applicants, to make sure that there's an understanding of the process really required to make these applications successful. A lot of this starts with planning, and while this does not fund planning directly, we know that there's a lot of planning going on that looks at compact development, infill development, small transit-oriented neighborhoods, things like that. And to that end, we want to encourage those of you who are in those planning stages to really think about these kinds of guidelines as a potential end result to fund some of those projects you're planning. So that's the first component. looking at trying to figure out what your project really is, you can see that this is not just about your housing development. This is about your housing development plus other things that are happening within that immediate neighborhood. How do you connect to transit, which is not part of your project at all, but it's part of an Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program project, right? It's thinking about this holistically and trying to think about project design as well as kind of how do you cultivate that partnership. These are hard partnerships to develop over time, and we know that it's going to take time for you to be competitive and achieve some of these objectives in the scoring criteria. And then finally, we are, as staff, committed to providing pre-application assistance. Before the NOFA is released, we're happy to meet with interested applicants, kind of continue to walk through the challenges of this program, talk to applicants about how to best set up partnerships. We've often served as matchmakers to this end, talking to housing developments in a city, but realizing that the transit agency is right there, but they don't know what to do and how to connect with the housing developers. So, and that's we've seen that everywhere in the state. And so we are happy to help facilitate some of those connections, and then just keep you apprised of the application going forward. Finally, the public comments are due, again, Friday, and we're hoping to get them all by email, and we will hopefully have a good feedback, good constructive feedback. Again, this doesn't work unless we know what's going on the ground and we can hear those comments. And then what I'm going to do next is Madeline is circulating with comment sheets and questions. We are looking at first, I'm going to ask if there are any clarifying questions on the guidelines themselves. Yeah, hold on. Let me see if we can get a mic. So, Megan over here. If you could identify yourself, that would be great.
Thank you. Megan Kirkby, California Housing Partnership. 2 clarifying questions. One, for the collaboration points, I think the intent is that to get those, you have to have $1 million for housing and $1 million for transit, not $1 million total, or not only $1 million total. Is that right?
Yeah, we would be looking. Okay. Yes, that is the intent. So we would be looking for $1 million investment both in affordable housing or housing-related infrastructure, plus at least a minimum of $1 million in sustainable transportation infrastructure.
Great. Or thank you. And then my second clarifying question was just, is there an established tiebreaker for if projects receive the same score? Or would the bins take care of that?
I don't think we've established a tiebreaker at this point. Last year we put it in the NOFA, and so we would do something similar, but we don't have anything in the guidelines. And I think it would be along the same lines as what we did last year. Right. So any comments or suggestions on that as well would be really helpful.
I don't remember what it was.
So I believe that the way it looked, it was tiebreaker points for depth of affordability first, and then second, the extent to which it benefited disadvantaged communities by score. And third is, I just saw this. Oh, the overall score. So if you were the top scoring out of the 2 that needed to be tie broken, you got an extra point. Something similar to that, though.
Thank you.
Okay, any other clarifying questions? And then we're going to go to public comment from there. Mia.
Hi, Allison. Mia Kong with Domus Development. Question, because we no longer have the cap for jurisdictions, I'm curious, is there another way you're looking at distribution statewide to kind of ensure whether it's north-south or suburban versus urban? Because I think, of course, urban areas have probably a higher GHG potential reduction score than, say, its counterpart suburban areas. So are you thinking about ways that you might be able to sort of create some distribution?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's a lot of what the conversation was about last week with the council. We brought forward just essentially a test looking at actual regional breakdowns and investment there. There was not by any means a strong indication from the council that they wanted to look at regional distribution of funds. However, what we've done is a couple of things. One, not only looking at the transit-oriented development projects which have robust transit, however, not incredibly robust. It's everything from downtown San Francisco to downtown Sacramento, which can be very different. The integrated connectivity projects, which could be more limited and less robust transit. And then the new rural innovation project area, which does not require the same level of, which does require the same level of transit, which is something we actually need to revisit a bit. But those are intended to identify different types of communities. But then to your question about statewide distribution, I think that is a council concern. They are looking at additional catalytic projects. So that is intended for the large-scale projects and some certainty there, but there isn't necessarily certainty of specific percentages in investments in specific areas. The intent is that we would come forward and acknowledge those geographic differences, and make sure that there's equal distribution, very loosely defined, depending on the kinds of projects we get also. So.
Hi, Allison. Michael Pimentel here with California Transit Association. So I'm actually not sure whether or not it would be most appropriate to levy my question in public comment or within just general guidelines. So I'm asking now. But for me, my question is, with the last round of funding, the ICP projects were largely housing. I'm wondering, what is staff doing? What is contained here within the guidelines to start to also consider the transit investments, and maybe more particularly those standalone transit investments? I know it's a concern that the council has at this point acknowledged and they're wanting to address, and I'm wondering what next steps might look like.
Well, certainly it's having the transit agencies come forward with good projects. I think that's first and foremost, and also acknowledging that there are other projects, other greenhouse gas reduction fund programs that also fund transit capital projects. Undersecretary Brian Annis from State Transportation Agencies in the audience, we've been talking a little bit about how to best really leverage the transportation capital programs, transit operation programs with the affordable housing sustainable communities programs. That's a challenge. It's a challenge to make any program work just in and of itself, but when you're looking at 2 or possibly 3 programs and a project that may compete in any of those 3 categories, right, or programs, it's a challenge. So the integrated connectivity project area has really looked at first the investment in transportation, and investment in complementary uses, so additional transit or transportation uses, affordable housing, housing infrastructure, right? To the extent that a transit agency could, one, come forward with a transit capital project that meets all of our other objectives. I mean, I think that's maybe part of the challenge is all of the other things that you're required to do as part of this program. You know, if that transit agency has a good project that is competitive, you know, we would certainly welcome that. I think that to your, in your interests, you know, to the extent that you can encourage some of your members to be more, to think a little bit more about how they can be competitive within that, I think that's really the direction the program's going. It's not, I think, and if those transit projects that your members have in mind are a little bit less broad in terms of their objectives, then we might want to think about other options, other funding options there. It's not a one size fits all. Yeah. And that was a decent question, general technical question. Not that it wasn't, you know, you're trying to figure out where it fit in the public comment versus technical question. Any other questions from the group? So there and then there. Keep your hand up.
Hi, Tristan Osborne with Cobblestone Placemaking. In terms of the secure overnight bike parking, would an applicant, if they exceeded that one space per 2 units, would that count as the second use? So if they, for instance, wanted to do one secure spot for every unit.
That's an excellent question. We hadn't considered that at this point, but we're happy to consider that as part of as a possibility. Over here, sir.
Hi, Steve Strain with Law Offices of Patrick Sablehouse. I'm just trying to figure out where this project fits. If you've got a project area that doesn't have high quality transit right now, just the qualifying transit, but your TRI is to extend the high quality transit into the project area. Are you ICP or TOD or?
Right. So your definition of transit is dependent upon your transit at the point of application. So if you are proposing to bring that into your, as part of your project, you would be qualified as an ICP. If you, say if you're a housing project and something like a bus rapid transit is coming into that period during project construction, still technically an ICP until that transit is operational. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, staff, for backing me up on that. It is complicated. I think we need to be a little bit clear in the guidelines about when that counts and when that doesn't. Sir.
Hi, I'm Luke Watkins with Neighborhood Partners. I can appreciate that you dropped the requirement for a sustainable transportation initiative in TODS because the infrastructure is already there. But why don't you think the infrastructure might also be there in areas that are not TODS? For example, I have an affordable housing site that is surrounded by green belts and bike paths, and there's a bus stop right at the site. So what's an example of a STI that I could do?
That's a good question. I think part of the challenge is making sure that that transit is strengthened and improved too. So it's about ensuring that housing development has incentives to use that bus stop, right? So it's different if you're just saying, yeah, there's a bus stop, check, we're done, right? But what we're trying to do is also encourage the use of that transit. So that could be through, if you're an ICP in that category, transit ridership program would count as your second, and it would be, you'd still qualify. So that's looking at trying to encourage transit ridership and change the behavior. That's still an eligible second use. You would still have.
It doesn't have to be a capital project?
Or
is that a capital
no, I take
project?
it back. I take it back. Sorry, I am also thinking, Jennifer. Last year's.
You would have to include a sustainable transportation infrastructure project, and then it could be combined with any other use. So you could do some sort of investment maybe in new buses.
Oh, you can
expanding
pay
the
for
fleet.
Buses.
Yeah, so you can pay for buses.
You have
and
to
that
increase frequency of stops.
You don't have to increase the frequency of the stops. You just have to have an investment that either increases access to it or increases access to the transit or increases access to the pedestrian or bicycle network.
But you couldn't, I'll stop in a minute, but you can't do trees and benches and
Not as your primary
lighting.
required use. That could be your secondary use. You have
Right.
to have at least two uses. So you have to have one that's going to be a capital project related to an infrastructure and expansion of those transportation networks, and then you could do some sort of urban greening type activity with it.
Right, but I'll stop in a minute, but this is an awesome location, right, where the locality has thought through the transportation network and made the developers put it all in. It sounds like all you could do is pay for buses, right? And the buses don't have to increase the frequency of stops there to qualify.
No, there wouldn't be a requirement to increase the frequency.
So Right. This is an interesting challenge because each project has a different component, different levels of transportation investment, transit investment, et cetera. So I think it sounds like this would not be an ideal AHSC project based on what we've got here and the existing transit infrastructure, unless there's something in addition that would enhance that connectivity and the sustainable transportation infrastructure. It's kind of example that we're looking for, particularly with more detail, to be able to understand really the nature of that excellent transportation infrastructure. It needs to be described to us if that helps us, right? To be able to better understand, okay, yeah, it's got a bike lane, yeah, it's got trails. Is that enough? Is there more that it's intended? It may not be the right site for this kind of program, and we may want to reconsider that given the type of project you may have.
Well, and this is the major source of affordable housing funding in the state now. So cutting out areas because they've done too good of a job at providing transportation infrastructure already, and denying them the right to get affordable housing built doesn't seem like it makes sense because you've already got this infrastructure that could be benefited from anyway.
So yeah, we acknowledge that this is one of the few sources of affordable housing funding out there. There's also the sustainable communities component that we want to enhance as well. So it's a balance. It's trying to make sure that we invest in our transportation and our transit systems equally, and if not necessarily in how we address certain projects. It is a challenge though, because we know that there are very different projects in different places. So any other technical questions? Thank you though for your comments. What happens in the challenge with this is not in trying to figure out, and at this point in guidelines development, debate whether or not one should be done over the other, but how do you best balance those two components, right? What's the best option if you do have substantive transportation improvements and you don't need to build anymore? What are the options if that's the case, right? And so that's the kind of feedback that we do need to hear, so we appreciate that. Any other technical questions? You have a, ma'am?
For bicycling improvements and also pedestrian.
Sorry, could you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, yes, sorry. Lindell Price. I'm an interested resident. For bicycling and pedestrian improvements, would traffic calming to reduce vehicle speeds qualify?
So that's a good question. I think we've generally we've had a couple of projects that have looked at that. I'm not sure how we addressed that in past years. I think they would qualify. They're not necessarily, you might want to look at how well they reduce VMT and how competitive they might be given the nature of the projects around. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and go to some public comments, but we've heard from Michael, we've heard from Steve Strain, Rico Mastrodonato.
Very good. Hi, Rico Mastrodonato with the Trust for Public Land, and thank you for the opportunity. And thank you for all your hard work and staff. My comment is really around the urban greening portion of the guidelines, which is at 10% total, but the actual points you get for trees and bioswales and native plants is 3 out of 100, and then you get 1 point for low impact design. We think it'll be challenging to see urban greening infrastructure being funded from this program the way it's scored right now. And when you think about the disadvantaged communities across the state, these are the communities that are almost completely hardscaped and have none of those features. And since this program is about mode shift largely, we think projects like open spaces, local parks, green alleys, etc., will not only induce non-motorized transportation, and of course non-motorized transportation is better than low-carbon transportation, we think it offers a multitude of co-benefits as well, including cooling our cities, which is another GHG benefit. These are the infrastructures that are going to absorb severe storm events and protect from sea level rise, not to mention the health benefits that come along with that. So, you know, needless to say, we would like to see that scoring enhanced and find ways to fund these kinds of projects that really, in my mind, are an integral part of a sustainable community. I have one other eligible cost. Should I wait till later to do that? Okay. Yes, I do. I won't break into song. Site acquisition is now considered a soft cost. There are instances, and it's capped at 30%, I believe. There are instances when site acquisition is important to the completion of a greenway, for instance, and we think that that should be considered an eligible cost. So thank you very much.
And so the staff here are scribbling notes, but I'm sure you'll submit formal comments. And to the extent that you can provide very specific examples of how, say, what that needs to be, what are the kinds of eligible costs in kind of a greenway or the green alleys project, et cetera. The more detail, the better. Again, we aren't mind readers, so we can only guess how that might work. So next is Alicia Sebastian. Right there?
Hi, Alicia Sebastian, California Coalition for Rural Housing. First, thank you so much for the rural set-aside that we're working with. I think it's really exciting. We're all ecstatic. And, right, we all knew there'd be an and the thresholds are still really problematic. You kind of mentioned that. You kind of are aware of it. We will be submitting a lot of comments. We're looking either for some flexibility in either ICP and the rural set-aside, or possibly we're suggesting separate thresholds and having different requirements in that. We're also really looking at that net densities and the conflicting definitions of urban, rural, and suburban. We're really recommending the infill housing grant program as a way to look at that as an alternative. And
sorry, did you say the infill housing grant program?
Yes.
Different than IIG, the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. No, that's fine.
Thanks for the backup.
No,
I'm like, yes.
Thanks very much.
No.
Any other, again, we were looking for any comments submitted by anyone on a white slip of paper. I want to acknowledge two MPOs, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations that are here in the audience. SACOG, we have Greg Chu and Renee DeViroki. And then for the San Joaquin Council of Government, it's Tanisha Taylor. And then I think a new staff person that I haven't met yet, Melanie Lee. So just because there is some fairly active coordination with your respective regional planning organization. We want to make sure that you are talking to them because they are also helping us put together partners and components to the extent that we can. This is a really vital component. We are not the only ones who know everything. We don't know everything, and so we rely on a lot of other sources to be able to do that. I've not received any new ones, but I'm going to ask, Steve, did you have any additional comments? Okay, and Michael? I've not received anything. Are there any other questions, any other challenges? Are we thinking, is there something that you guys want to flesh out a little bit more? I'm happy to go through any of the scoring criteria and really think about those. Mr. Pappas.
Okay. Hi, I'm James Pappas with California Housing Partnership. And my question is about the GHG scoring and the kind of two components of it, primarily the total project GHG scoring And if you guys have thought about different alternatives for structuring that. I mean, the way it's presented, it's very straightforward, total project GHG reduction score, but that seems like it could highly favor large projects, and maybe that's partly the intent. But have you guys thought about doing it perhaps related to like a unit at a per unit level, so that it wouldn't so much skew towards large projects, but it still wouldn't duplicate the leverage, which is more factored in the second part, the efficiency. So just wondering if there's been any thought about that.
The answer to your question is yes, we've thought about it. But I think that's a good question. Again, back to the range and diversity of projects across the state, which ones are, and again, this is 30 points total, which looks at more of the quantity, how much, and how efficient are you at your reductions per your ask. 30 points versus 55, which was a big chunk. Looking at all the other policy and other supplemental strategies, does a specific project still fare well enough to be competitive, right? I think that's part of it. You can do that on a smaller scale with a larger project and not necessarily be in the top bin here. The other thing that we did in comparison to last year, these bins, because it was 55 total points, we looked at increments of 11 points, which made it almost impossible for any project to overcome that 11-point difference, regardless of how well you could have been a superstar in any of the other project program criteria. Here, you have 3 points as increments for 2 bins, so it's about a 6-point. Potentially 6 points that you would need to make up. It's a little bit easier to do that, actually, and it just depends on the combination and the project you bring forward. Any other questions? Anything else? This is an easy group. Is this just because it's Monday? Is this just because, okay, Alicia, and then, well, actually, Holly, right, you had some questions? Why don't you go ahead and please introduce yourself.
Holly Wonder Styles from Mutual Housing California. I had a question about the requirement for ICP projects to have sustainable transportation infrastructure. And it looked like with the changes, proposed changes, that it means that only affordable housing projects in ICP are the only projects remaining that need to have both transportation and housing. And so it seemed perhaps unfortunate that that type of project is the only one that's required to have that type of partnership.
Your observation is correct. I would say that the encouragement is, so it's a challenging position because we recognize that some of those integrated connectivity, I think you might have missed the conversation we had a bit earlier. We had a conversation about if you already had existing transportation infrastructure in an ICP project area, what do you do? I think that is a challenge. It's something that, again, we need to think about given the dynamics of the program, the need to balance both the housing and the transportation investment needs and the connectivity needs. I think that that's worth providing to us in terms of feedback and a comment, and really trying to figure that out. Is the alternative to require transportation in a TOD? Is the alternative to allow an ICP to not have transportation? I feel like those are really sticky subjects and really challenging, so we appreciate any critical thinking that you can to help support the broader goals given your projects.
I mean, we have a whole letter. There's lots of comments, and we're rural, so we have a lot to say about that. So I'm going to speak to one that's a little bit more general, which is the use of walk score. Yeah, nod your heads with me. Yeah, so we're getting a lot of feedback, especially in rural areas, that just doesn't apply. But also, I'm wondering if that's working for other areas because it's not the tool of choice.
Right. So the question is, I'm going to kind of repeat that and interpret it a little bit. So one of the scoring criteria is access to destinations, and the way that we are proposing to measure it is through walk score. There's essentially bike scores in the same tool, the same online tool. One of the challenges is walk score measures what you already have, and if you don't have it, you don't score as well. And that can be a challenge, particularly for rural and smaller areas that don't have the access to those destinations yet. Right? So the question is there a comparable alternative? Sorry, I'm asking the question back to you. Is there a comparable alternative that gets you there? And how do we best resolve that? So that's, you don't have to answer it unless. Yeah, okay. And so staff are also saying, you know, particularly for a rural project area, they would only compete with each other. So at least, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best tool. Acknowledged.
Yeah, I was this is on the same topic, on a call this morning with LA Bike Coalition. They were talking about the fact that Bike Score isn't quite ready for prime time yet. And that I guess it's definitely based on the amenities, even the walk score, but that there are certain places where they haven't done the research as well, basically. And so I'm definitely not proposing a solution, but some other ideas that have been talked about are looking at the way that the HCD TOD program did this, with having a list of destinations. So you kind of you could very clearly tell if you were going to be in or out of the point score on this. And somebody else brought up that might also help if you were adding a destination as part of your project, like adding a grocery store. Then you could be saying, well, there's not a grocery store here now, but we're adding that as one of our destinations. So that was one way of thinking about it.
Thanks. And I think that's a big challenge is identifying future improvements, right? We think there's going to be a grocery store here. It's kind of similar to looking at GHG reductions to particular retail use when you don't know it's going to be there for certain things like that. So, but any suggestions on how to improve that would be really helpful, or alternatives to that. Again, we are working with the best tools we have out there that is applicable to a broader category of projects. All right, any other, Ms. Taylor.
Tanisha Taylor, San Joaquin Council of Governments, and we've already submitted a letter, so I'm going to echo some of the points in the letter in terms of leveraging and how difficult it is for projects within disadvantaged communities. You heard from the Mayor of Fresno to simply get to the finish line to apply for these funds and to bring additional funds beyond those which they've called together from a housing authority or the cities themselves. To get through and get invited to a full application is very difficult and very challenging. I know you've changed the metric, and we appreciate that you've changed the metric, but it is still a metric of leveraging and how much funding is available and how much funding you can bring to the table. That becomes very challenging when we're talking about some of the types of funding, especially for transportation funding, where they're formula driven, and formulas, we all know, don't do well in small and rural communities. To provide that extra discretionary funding that can be used in leveraging. So if we could find a way to acknowledge the challenges that come with disadvantaged communities and bringing additional funding to the table and leveraging to get through that first step to the full application, and then to actually get those 5 points for leveraging and to score well in the GHG category, which accounts for 15 points when it comes to leveraging as an efficiency of reductions. I think that would be beneficial in helping the Valley as well as some of the smaller rural cities compete in the program and get past that first initial screening for the program as well.
Thank you. I might start picking on people. But so this is part of the interesting challenge, though. These are, again, this is an opportunity for you to provide public feedback and comments, for us to actually talk a little bit back and forth about what does that mean for your specific project or your particular community. And it helps inform those public comments that we hopefully get. You know, we like getting as specific and detailed as possible. We've been doing a really good job of trying to read and disseminate them to the extent that we can. So actually, yes, Holly and then Megan. Okay.
I just had a question about in the calculation of the enforceable financing commitment, it shows that you, in the numerator, you subtract the deferred costs. And so I'm wondering, in that situation, what is your definition there of deferred costs?
Eugene Lee, HCD. I think you understand many of these costs are deferred till perm. You know, we're speaking most notably, you know, the deferred developer fees, some legal syndication fees. Those are typically the things that we're speaking of. Right. So that, you know, we recognize that you don't necessarily, you're taking that value of money that's associated to pay those things, yeah, out from the numerator. Yeah. It's not limited to addressing developer fees, don't get me wrong, okay? But, you know, what we're essentially trying to do is evaluate how much money you have to actually get the development built, okay? Recognizing that some of them are you can't avoid, but so there are some costs that are deferrable, okay?
So, Eugene, can you give me an example just because
But if your deferred costs are going to be covered, let's say, by your tax credit equity, that's not one of your enforceable commitments, it doesn't seem that it should be subtracted from the amount of commitments that you have together with your AHSC request. Right?
I would probably let's have a conversation in this, you know, kind of comment period. You know, give me your kind of written comment on it. You know, it's the way it's written right now, but you know. Right, yeah. Greg?
I think the last question on the equity, that would be relative to the timing of that equity pay-in. If it's at perm, close, or after, it would still count as deferred for the purpose of this calc. But
if you don't have a commitment, that you have.
So there's a couple things. First is I would really, just because it's not in the guidelines and I like to check these things, just a definition of deferred costs so that we understand what that means. And then it might be defined in the guidelines but not in the appendix. It's one of those things. Just a cross-reference. And then to James's point, looking at enforceable fund commitments, looking at including 4% tax credits as an EFC, you would not consider a 9% request, because unless you have your credit in hand, your allocation in hand, it's not an enforceable funding commitment. So that would not, but I think it addresses some of the what you're considering as a deferred cost. I don't know. Okay, so that's something we definitely need to clarify, and to the extent that staff can help work through some of that and make it really clear, that would be really helpful. So, you're looking it up, Brandon? Okay, we'll pause on that.
And I didn't list these as comments because maybe these are more discussion starters, but some things that have come up along the way for me were with the economic displacement points. You get 2 points when you have more than 3 economic displacement policies in place for your jurisdiction, but there's only 5 policy examples listed there, and it seemed like there would be probably no jurisdictions that that get you to 4 out of 5 of those. So maybe increasing that list of examples would be helpful. But interested in what others have to say. And then on the community engagement scoring, it seems like a really comprehensive list of things you do during your entitlement phase. But it does seem like if your entitlement phase was a while ago, you may not have had a tracking system in place for those things. So I'd just be interested in other people's comments about, is there a better way to do that category and accomplish the same worthy goal? And then maybe this is a bigger topic, but something that's been on my mind with the question about, what if there's really great transit in place? How do we factor that in? Maybe I definitely see the very worthy goal of better integration with transit, but maybe there's a menu of options there. So you could do more transit-related amenities and programs in cases where there was already really good capital infrastructure there, to sort of, whereas I think right now it kind of incentivizes you doing one sustainable transportation infrastructure thing. Maybe there's a case where multiple transit-related amenities sort of compensate for not doing a sustainable transportation infrastructure piece, but those are just thoughts.
Anything else? Look at this. I like, so we'll go, actually, if you could, Jeannie, raise your hand, and she'll give you that, and we'll go to her next.
Thanks, Allison. Jeannie Wardwaller with the California Bicycle Coalition. I just wanted to make a couple of points, maybe kind of building off what people have already said. We support the concerns with bike score and walk score. I think we have to be careful, particularly about how those scores show up in disadvantaged areas where there aren't a lot of amenities, and maybe the destinations that we want to make sure we're providing access to may be a little bit different, things like healthcare and other services. And those don't always show up well in walk score and bike score. So we'll be happy to think through, maybe there's a different criteria if you're also in a census tract that's an EnviroScreen census tract or something like that. The other thing I wanted to say was just sort of about more innovative treatments, and I think, Allison, we talked about this before, and our written comments will speak to this as well, but I think particularly with bike infrastructure, we want to be looking at things like protected bike lanes and real separation from traffic, not just a striped bike lane, particularly if your project or development is on a really high speed or high volume street. So we'd like to see a little bit of a distinction there. If you're in an area that's already really, the traffic's calm, you have a separated bike trail, you should be able to get full points for that. But developments that are in really high traffic areas, we really need to see that separated infrastructure to get the mode shift that we're looking for. So we need to probably think through a way to do that a little bit better in the guidelines.
Thank you.
Oh, Lindell Price, just an interested California resident. I'd like to see a clearer distinction between recreational trail type facility. In fact, I have concerns with the use of the term trail in this context. If we want to see a mode shift, the pedestrian and bicycling facilities need to be 24-hour all-weather facilities that people will use to commute pre-dawn, after dark, and so forth. And the wording is fuzzy.
Thank you. The one thing I did want to note is that even if you didn't fill out a comment form because you had a comment, we also wanted to try to gather as much information from those of you who have projects potentially coming forward for this year's funds makes it a bit easier for us to be able to identify and follow up with you if there are some specific comments. So I know some of you are kind of just gathering information on behalf of others, but what it helps us better focus on where we need to do some of our specific outreach. You know, we have your lists, we know of your projects. We are certainly focusing on those who submitted in the first round, because again, a known universe of interested applicants. And so any information you have, and some have just given me the sheet without a specific question, totally fine. If you want to do that, please give that to Madeline or Kim. We were going to go through, is there anything, staff, that I've forgotten? And because this is the first one, we haven't really done this before, so we don't really know what we're forgetting at this point. I'm going to go back and just remind y'all of the timelines. Everyone hates it when I look at the calendars, but this is essentially where we are on things. So to the extent that we are able to go through and provide these workshops, and as you see, it's kind of a hybrid, right? It's a little bit about here's what's new, but here's how we can help your specific application, and we do a little bit of, you know, a little bit of on-the-ground technical assistance, if you will. You know, we're going to be revising the draft guidelines simultaneously as in terms of doing this and getting, trying to develop and cull applications and help provide application support. There is some technical assistance funding available for grant writing and some data analysis. They may be limited funds for this first year. So again, the more you can, filling these out really helps us better identify who is out there. We will have our final guidelines posted in December of this year and adopted. Ideally, we will have a revised quantification methodology that complements that draft guidelines document. We are, because of the timing of the updates to the model, not sure when that might occur, to the CalEMod model. We'd like to make sure that, in theory, it's ready, but we don't know, and it's not. It's something that we're quite in control over this year, or ever, actually. And so we would like to have that, the proposed quantification methodology ready at the same time that the NOFA comes out, at the very least. We didn't, and we will not, this upcoming year, require you to do that greenhouse gas calculation at concept. So again, part of that simplified concept app is that you don't have to do the calculations for the quantification. So there's a little bit of time before and it's really intended for those at full application. So we hope to have a revised draft QM and possibly adapt it over the spring. We also hope to have, if not the concept and the full, at least the concept application available in draft form by the time the guidelines go to council. So last year we didn't even have that ready, I would almost say by the time the NOFA was done. This year we're hoping to have at least a draft concept app so you know the components that are required. You can get things ready, things like resolutions from your governing boards, things that take a little bit more time, some certainty on dates so you know when you have to have your readiness requirements, particularly entitlements, permits, CEQA, NEPA, and site control. Those would be required to be done by the full application deadline. So even if you are going through concept, you still have to shoot for that same time frame to be done. So we would have most of those in place by December when we go to council. So we're trying to provide as much certainty as we can, but we're still trying to also do a lot of things in concert with each other. Mia. So the concept, the timing, the question was timing from between concept and full application. And here it says February, and February that the apps would be due, and the full apps would be due in April. I would say err on, we think that it'll probably be about 4 to 6 weeks to review the concept apps. And then we would turn the invites to full app around within a week. And then we would probably give another 6 to 8 weeks for a full app to be due. I would absolutely suggest you send that to us in writing. We would love more time for not only for you to do the applications, but for us to review them. The review, absolutely. We think that with the increased award amounts, the increased total dollars available, we're going to get a lot of applications. The uncertainty at concept in particular is how many are we going to really get? What's realistic here? And then the second part is, okay, now that we've done that, even though we've given more certainty to applicants on what the application is and all of these other things, what do we need to get a good application through and get the right, do the right thing in terms of technical assistance and other things? I think that would be really helpful. The reality of putting together an application like that, you guys all did it under intense circumstances and it was fine, but could it be better? Yeah.
With respect to timing, very good points. I echo Allison's points. So what this does is you're thinking of a housing development project, okay? And if that were the case, if I were in your shoes, I would really try to see if you're still thinking of a 9% type of tax credits, you have to really deliberately look at 2017 as getting that reservation, and you know better how competitive you are, okay? You don't have a whole lot of time beyond calendar year 2017 if you're thinking 9%, okay? Just what the performance deadlines we have in this program.
I think we're trying to set the expectation that the awards are issued in preparation for a spring tax credit round, regardless, and shifting it as opposed to shooting for that June deadline every year, which is not as reasonable given the complexity of this application, the quantity of applications we hope to receive. So, I mean, I think just as a reality check, we know that housing developers can put together these applications, that they can do it if that's what the deadline is and that's what you're shooting for. But I think we're trying to shift that slightly to allow for better applications, for sure. Thanks. So again, so this is this is kind of our proposed timeline. If there's other concerns, we'd love to hear them. If there's anything that we didn't quite cover, we're happy to go through that, and we'll stick around for questions. I want to thank you all for coming. If there's anything else that you want to submit and follow up on, please feel free to do it through the email. And we're all pretty responsive to, questions, although when we're on the road, a little less so. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you soon, I'm sure. Thank you.